love to hear from you. We're starting to receive them in, and just jot it down somewhere. There's a box in the back in the comments, and be happy to hear your questions. And today's question, as I said, is someone asked, how do you know that there is a God? How do you know that there is a God? And this is a great question. And actually, it's a very contemporary question, because there actually is a growing number of people out there who are openly saying that they don't believe there is a God. It's also kind of a hard question, because postmodern people in our world today want rational proof of everything. And if you were looking for me to scientifically prove or demonstrate the existence of a God, that's not possible. God is someone you come to know by faith, and faith is the conviction of things that you cannot see. But of course, a good atheist would respond by saying, believing in things you cannot see is like believing in fairy tales. But to us who have experienced God, it's not nonsense at all. There are a couple of things that are close to a proof of God. Physics has discovered that somehow, and amazingly, that every particle and every subparticle in the whole universe is somehow communicating with each other. And how it's possible that the minutest particle on one end of the universe can communicate with the minutest particle on the other end of the universe is unimaginable. And so there are some physicists today who are seriously saying that, well, maybe the whole universe is the body of God. The whole universe itself is the body of God, which is kind of a neat idea. And of course, even if you subscribe to the Big Bang theory, which most credible scientists do today, you still have that problem with that first sort of golf ball size mass of matter, that is there, that has to be there. And of course, one suggestion is it all just sort of happened by random chance, but it's also just as rational to say that whatever that golf ball size of supermass was, that it had to be created by a creator. That's just as rational to say that. And there's also some evidence in human society. When you look at the behavior of mankind in every time and every place since humans have walked the earth, going all the way back 10,000 years, the belief in a God of some kind has always been there. Even in the most isolated islands and places on the planet. And Blaise Pascal once said the reason is because there's this God-sized hole inside of us, and the only thing that can fill it is God. You can call it an emptiness or an abyss or a yearning or a sense of incompleteness in our existence, but there's something that tells us something is missing, that there has to be something more, that we need God to fill that emptiness within us. But of course, this doesn't necessarily convince everyone. I mean, atheists will respond that, well, life is imperfect and broken, and the horrible thought of not existing terrorizes us with fear. And so humans everywhere have simply invented a God and invented an afterlife just to take that fear from us. And it's a good lie to keep us from letting our fears overcome us. So I guess you could say there are some sort of proofs of God, but it's not possible to definitely prove that there is a God, at least until Jesus comes again. And whatever we say about the God's question, we need to keep in mind that and take seriously that there are many postmodern people saying to us today that if you talk about God, you have to prove to us that he's real, and that you haven't simply invented this for whatever reason you have, because you feel like you need something to take away the fears and the trials of life. And so here's my answer, and it's the best that I can come to at this point. I suppose you could say, if there is a God, the clearest and simplest way to prove that he exists would be if he shows himself, right? If he appears outside of us and says, "Hi, it's me. Here I am. I'm God, and I exist, and I'm here." Right? I mean, I think we could all agree that that would be a proof, wouldn't it? And that would certainly convince everyone. Look, it's me. I'm here. I'm God. But if it's just philosophy or reasoning or moralistic preaching, then there's no real way to prove that this is not just our own ideas or human projections of a God or our man-made philosophies created for our own purposes that we have somehow elevated into the notion of a God for our own self-serving purposes. So with that in mind, this is how Christians come to a kind of amazing proof of God. And this may sound silly at first. It may sound ridiculous at first, but it's not. The greatest proof we have of God is that the things we say about him are so foolish and crazy that they make no sense whatsoever. Only a person who is actually there could be this irrational, because no one in his right mind would ever make up the stuff that we say as Christians. No one would make this up. And in fact, Paul, as I read to you this morning in his letter to the Corinthians, boasts of how crazy the things we say about God in Christ are. He says, "Where are the wise? Where are the philosophers of this age? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom could not know him, God was pleased with the foolishness of what we preach, the story we have to tell, to save those who believed." In other words, the things that we say about God, and just let me list a few. That he was born in the dirt by an unwed mother, that he had and has a body, even though he's eternal God, that God was shamed and beaten and tortured and killed, and he allowed it to happen. God killed, tortured, and he let it happen. That God died. I mean, God died. How could God die? God, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How could God die for the sake of people who were completely impure, unworthy, and unredeemable in themselves? That he is completely three persons, unique and individual, but only one God. And one of those persons became a human being, completely human. And that he will come again and raise us up bodily from the grave. This is nuts. What person would ever invent such a crazy thing? But can you see how that gives the gospel story validity of what God is and has done? I mean, the story seems so believable because it's so unbelievable. No rational person with any reasonable sense of God would ever say the things that we say. And Paul says in another place, if Christ has not really been raised from the dead, then we're idiots. We are complete fools because we have told a madman's tale. But Paul reminds us the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. God doesn't have to be anything that we think he should, or do anything that we think he should, or be the way we think he has to be, because his thinking isn't ours. And I think that makes him God and makes him believable. And in fact, this is really important because, when we talk about original sin, this is where this comes in. What Christians say is that when it comes to really knowing God intuitively, when we try to figure God out, our reason doesn't work. It's always distorted. Our human mind is not a reliable tool in reaching truths about God. It's kind of like, remember the Hubble telescope? They spent nearly $1 billion to send this telescope up into space, and when he finally got up there, it was all fog because it wasn't focused properly. Christians say our mind is like that. It is a distorted pair of glasses because of human sin. And when I mean sinner, don't think moralistically here. Think of sin as totally self-centered. That's what we are, totally self-centered. And when it comes to knowing about God, we're clueless because we're so wrapped up in ourselves, in our own world, that whenever we look out to see God, in the end, what we see is always curved back in on ourselves. Our distorted reason always turns God into an image, not of him, but of ourselves. So unlike nearly every other religion which says, well, you have to reason, you philosophize, think your way to God, or you have to be on a path to God, or unlike our society today, which just accepts that, well, God is whatever God is for you, whatever you think God is, that's okay. Christians say that doesn't work. Because what you end up with is always distorted by you and your experiences and your needs and your issues and your hurts. And in a sense, this is really very postmodern. Because postmodern science today says it's impossible for there to be any pure investigation of anything. Because whenever you investigate something, you're in it. And you always change what you're investigating because you are observing it and involved in the observation of it. Or to put it another way, people will often say, I believe that God is, right, for me. Right? And usually what that is some kind of salad bar of their ideas and wants and needs and hurts. Right? Well, that God is not God. It's their own personal philosophy dressed up as God. So you see, Christians say we are a faith and not a religion. We will say we are not a religion because we believe in a person and not in ideas or ideals or reasoned philosophy or a system of thought, but about God who is a person, a separate person, and he is out there, outside of us, and he is unique, and we are separate creatures. And so if we can accept or think about the idea that reason and our thinking can't get us to God, then the only way we can know him is if he comes to us and reveals himself and says, here I am, this is me, I'm God, and I am certainly not what you expect. And that's what Christians mean when we say faith in God comes through the Holy Spirit who is outside of us. He reveals God to us from the outside. He comes to us. And we are not on a path to him or a reasoned philosophy about him or a reasoned belief in him. And all we can know about God is what he tells us when he comes to us. I always say it's kind of like being in a marriage. You can't reason your way to your spouse. Our spouses are probably the most unreasonable people on the planet, right? Because we never have them figured out, and hopefully, gladly, we never do, or we'd be marrying ourselves, right? But they always speak outside of us, and they're always different than us, and we never have them completely figured out. The only way we know where they're coming from and what they're feeling and what they're thinking is if they talk to us, and if they tell us. And what they say is always a surprise to us. So we only know what God is like by what he shows us and what he has done for us. And Christians say what he's done for us is we know that he's loving in all of his actions, and that he wants to reconcile the whole world into a relationship with him. And we say, how do we know God has come to us and he's there? That's the story that we tell. We tell this story that God has come to us. He came to us at Jesus' birth in a real person, and he was really on this earth in a real history. If there had been newspapers, they could have recorded that he was here, and yet he claimed and claimed and claimed, I am God. I and the Father are one. And he appeared at his resurrection to hundreds of people. And that made no sense whatsoever because no one expected. It was crazy, irrational. How could a man be God, we could ask, and how could Jesus be dead and then walk around and talk to people? All this was so crazy that we know they killed him. But he came and appeared to hundreds of people and revealed himself to them, and showed him in his body to be alive again, showed them his hands and feet. And hundreds of witnesses became part of a real written record that said, God is alive, we have seen him, we talked to him, and he told us of his love and his peace. And all those witnesses have been passed down to us. And so as Luther reminded us, faith comes through what is heard. We hear scripture, and we hear stories of real people who say to us, I have seen the Lord. He came to me, and I know my Redeemer lives. He is living and kind and wants to be in a real relationship with me, not just in my head, but in my life and in my heart and in my being. So how do we know there's a God? Well, in one sense, we don't. It's always a gift, because we can't get to God. Religion is not a path toward God, but faith is God's path toward us. Faith is God's path toward us. And if we are open and listen to the stories of people in the Bible, witnesses, and hear the gospel, and hear the written record of witnesses who know that there was a God and who have seen him and know he's there and know the wonderful things he's done for us, then we'll know there's a God, and we are here because there are so many of us who say, I know there is a God, not here, but I know there is because I have seen him alive in my life and experienced him in my life. And let me just finish with one other side of the coin. It's personal, but I guess I would find it hard to live in a world where there was no God. And let me just give you this true example. Many years ago, I had some very good friends, a couple, who had a son who was their firstborn. And he was 3 months old, and they loved him dearly. Cute, blonde-haired little baby, just so full of life. But when his mom got up to change him in the middle of the night, she discovered he wasn't breathing. It was SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And to add insult to injury, both parents were interrogated by the police for days as suspects, because it took weeks for the coroner to release them from suspicion because Back then, it wasn't always easy to distinguish SIDS from just gentle suffocation. They went through hell. And it took them years to get over that tragedy and to make sense of it and to see a reason and a purpose in it. And it was really their faith and the faith of all the people who gathered around them that helped them do that, to heal from all that. And they finally came to see something larger in it and to see something good in it. And they felt God's presence in helping them to get through it. And they saw God come to them in their lives and in the lives of people who were so loving and caring to them. But consider this. If there is no God, then things like this have no reason and no purpose, and they're only meaningless random chance and cruel nature, and there is only emptiness and loss that can never change, and all you can say is, well, it's just tough. That's just the way it happened, that's just the way it is, and there's no reason for it. That's not, thank goodness, the world I live in, and I hope it's not the world that you live in. I know God is alive. Whenever someone comes to me and says, I don't believe in God, they at least have to deal with me because I know God is alive. I have experienced Him in my life since I was this high. And I know He loves us all. And I know that in terrible times we find He comes to us and we realize that He is there in our lives. And He promises that one day our pain and suffering will all be healed. Yes, there is a God. And He's not a rational being, and He's not a path, and He's not some system or philosophy. He is a person who is loving and kind and forgiving and life itself. And if you are open like so many others, if you wonder, all I can say is, He will come to you. When you stop all your vigorous ways of trying to reach Him, just let go. And He will come to you and say, here, I am here. I love you. And I am real. Amen.